Good evening. It's very good to be here. And the topic is religion bad for the world? It's a bit of a surprise that this has become an issue, although it is one in British culture at the moment, in the sense that when I was young, lots of people weren't religious, but I can't remember anybody saying it was actually bad for the world. Everybody assumed it was rather good. And the general tenor is put over by a rumour that MI5 was very interested in terrorism and the prevention of extremism, and intended to investigate the Mothers' Union. Well, of course, religion is a very wide term. Some religions are not at all good. I imagine religions which sacrifice young ladies to the gods, or religions which worship Satan, are not particularly good, most of us would think. So it's very hard to say religion as such is either good or bad. There are all sorts of different religions. Most of the main religions in the world today, though, contain lots of different types of people, and they have lots of different ways of living. Well, I know in this hall there are Baptists and Methodists and Anglicans and no doubt Quakers and goodness knows what else. So you would all have some differences from each other. So if you say there's even such a thing as Christianity, you may agree with that in general, but when you get down to detail, there are quite a lot of distinctions to be made. Well, you can't spend all your life making distinctions, although I've had a very good try, but you can have to differentiate. And that's the first thing to say. If you're going to talk about religion, make distinctions where they need to be made. And any statement that religion is good or bad is bound to be misleading. It's like saying, is art good or bad? And you say, well, do you mean Tracy Emin or Rembrandt? And clearly you might give different answers, or you might not, if you're thinking about them. So I'm going to divide this into four short parts. First of all, I'll ask the question about the connection between religion and violence and warfare, because my colleague Richard Dawkins has claimed that religion is the root of violence in human nature, so I'm going to ask if that's true from a historical point of view. Then I look at the question, well, is religion bad because it teaches young people to believe things just on authority or on faith without any evidence? And again, Richard Dawkins says that religious education of children is child abuse, so clearly he thinks it's not very good even to tell people about religion. And thirdly, I'll ask if religious ethical views are immoral, or if not actually immoral, at least out of date. And hasn't the world, in parts, moved beyond religious morality? In any way, should morality be based on authority anyway? So that's a question. And finally, I'll look at the issue of whether religion is bad for your health, and whether it's a symptom of mental illness. I've certainly debated with people who've held that I am mentally ill because I have religious beliefs. I remember Peter Atkins, a well-known chemist in Oxford, in a public debate saying, well, the reason I had religious beliefs was that I had too much oxygen in my brain. So I offered him some oxygen, but he wouldn't. So well, let's look at those one by one. It's going to be a bit brief, so it's a bit nutshell. I'll be happy to respond to questions later if there are more specific things. But violence. Well, human beings are very violent. But what's the connection with religion? I mean, if you look at the most famous cases in the world today, I suppose Islamic State or ISIS, you say, well, that looks like a religious war. It's a war which tends to eliminate other religions and just support its own. Well, that's true. There are religious wars. There often have been religious wars. But there have been wars which have nothing to do with religion. And the most obvious example that some of us can remember are the two world wars. And they didn't have any religious background. It was, on the whole, Christians fighting Christians. And it wasn't even Catholics versus Protestants or Baptists versus Methodists. It was really just a war about what? Well, it's a bit difficult to say, really, but it wasn't about religion anyway. And then you look back in history and you say, well, what is the most terrible, bloody time in history? And what wars were the most violent and terrible? I suppose I would pick out the Mongols and Genghis Khan, who conquered most of the known world at the time. Nothing to do with religion at all. What about the Roman Empire? whether you liked it or not. It conquered all the nations round about. It had a vast empire. They didn't have any particular religious views. Of course, they got people to worship Caesar in the end, but that was a political view rather than a religious one. So if you look at history, there are not many religious wars. There are not many wars which have been motivated by religion, but there are lots of wars. Most wars, I think, have been motivated by ethnic hatred and love of more property, ground room, living space, and just the conquest of the world. Well, even the English have done a little bit of that, so you have to say, well, yes, people do just like to start empires and conquer people. You can send missionaries along later if you want, but it's not the missionaries who do the conquering. It's the soldiers and the politicians. So human beings are just violent, and I think the record of history is that history is littered with greed and hatred and violence. And that is exactly what Christianity says. Because Christianity says, well, the basic trouble with the human race is that it is mired in sin, in pride, in greed and hatred and violence. It is. That's the condition we're in. So Christianity actually agrees with that assessment. People are just violent. Well, people, unfortunately, you may think, get into religions. It would be very nice if you could keep all the violent people out of religions, but that's a bit of a problem. Suppose you're running a religion, or even a church, right? You're running a church, and a violent person wants to join your church. What do? You say, no, sorry, we are pure and peaceful, you can't come in. Or do you say, no, we welcome sinners? And they say, good, I'm coming for I have some good sins now. Well, you may hope to change their minds, of course, but do you actually throw them out? And so there's the problem. I'm afraid it is true that in any institution, this is a terrible thing to say, if I'm being put on television I get told off after this, but that the people who lead any large institution are often, and most of the time, going to be there because they are ambitious and ruthless. That goes for popes, it goes for archbishops, it goes for moderators, it even goes for ministers in churches. So you might start off with thinking, oh, I'm going to serve the people and be humble and poor, but you know, it's a great temptation to actually get yourself taken as an authority, one to whom people defer, and then you're really ministering to your own arrogance and pride. So arrogance and pride goes with, it's a temptation for everyone who takes positions of authority. And that's true in religion as well as anywhere else. So if Christianity is right about sin, you're going to expect that religions are, on the whole, Christian religions too, going to be very often run by ambitious and ruthless people. That's what you've got to expect. So where does that lead you to think? Because that's what Christianity says is true. Just remember this fact that all Christians do believe. Jesus criticized the religious more than he criticized anybody else, and he was killed by the religious leaders of his own society. So you've got to say, religion, big institution, the bigger it gets, the more temptations there are to human sin, and that's just what we expect. It's no surprise. What Christianity does is offer forgiveness, but of course, it doesn't absolutely change everyone's character. I mean, just think of the last church meeting you went to. Did everybody suddenly be filled with the Holy Spirit so that they all agreed with everybody? Each other? I don't think that, well, if it did, Kidlington is an amazing place, I must say. Probably not. People disagree about everything, given the chance. So disagreements there, and then, so therefore that could lead to hatred. It shouldn't. Now, I'm not condoning this, but if you say, is religion violent? What I'm saying is this: any institution will pander to the aggression and the anger and the arrogance of every human being. I'm not excluding me, I'm including all of us, because that's what sin is. The best you can do is repent and ask for forgiveness, but you know you're going to do it again. You know you are. But repentance and forgiveness is always available. So you're not going to eliminate sin. So we're not looking for a perfect church. Well, if you think you're in one, you're arrogant. So you're caught in a pretty big sin there. So, if you say, is religion a cause of violence? Historically, no, it's not a major cause of violence. Even in cases, well, let's take the Crusades. Just, I can't go on too much about violence, but I'm using my voice, that's violence. Get into it. People often say about the Crusades, especially there's an Islamic sort of upthrust of thought that the Crusades are what the West does to Islam. Well, the Crusades were pretty bad. They were taken over by thieves and rogues and vagabonds, that's certainly true. But in their origin, the Crusades were, I would say, an absolutely justified war of defense. That may surprise you because it's unusual. You'll say that sort of thing. But if you ask what were the Crusades in their origin, the fact was that the Roman Empire had broken into two parts, the Western Roman Empire, based on Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, based on Istanbul, Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, was overcome, but Constantinople went on. That was the Byzantine Empire. So it was the Latin Roman Empire in Istanbul, Constantinople. So they were attacked by an Arabic force, which happened to be Muslim, but the Arabs were just conquering all that part of the world around there. So the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople was attacked by the Arabs and asked for help from their cousins in what remained of the Western Roman Empire, which was the Pope by then. So the Pope got people to go and defend Constantinople against attack, and that was the First Crusade. So just put it in historical perspective. I'm not defending the Crusades as something that was wholly good. It went terribly wrong, and it was taken over by thieves and vagabonds. But in its essence, it was a war of defense of a Latin empire against an Arabic aggressive conflict. So if you're going to accept violence at all, that war of defense seems not to be as bad as you might think. So I think we shouldn't just automatically think, oh dear, the Crusades, that was a terrible thing to do. It wasn't really. It was a terrible thing to do for the Arabs to attack Constantinople. So, you know, just you have to look at all sides of the picture. And when you do that, you find out that, well, very few Christians have actually been pacifists. Quakers notably are pacifists, but most Christians have agonized about it, but said, well, in the end, it is right to have a defense against the innocent. And you may be surprised to know that that is exactly the same view as is taken by traditional Islam, not by Islamic State, obviously, but by traditional Islam. And I've talked a lot about just wars and the justification for violence with Muslim scholars from Al-Azhar University in Egypt, the main Muslim university. And we agree almost completely, that is, on what is our traditional view. And the traditional view is you don't attack innocent people, you don't kill the innocent, you certainly don't kill people by putting bombs on yourself and exploding. That is totally against the tradition. What you do is you defend the innocent if they are being attacked. So there is a complication there. I mean, who thinks who is attacking whom? That can be rather complicated. When do you think you're being attacked? And of course, it is the case that in our modern world, it is true that Western powers, including notably Britain, have attacked other countries and ruled them. I mean, 100 years ago, every Muslim country in the world was ruled by a Western country. If you think that, you can understand why people feel aggrieved. So you can understand that. I'm not defending it, but you have to understand that people are not motivated by religious beliefs, because every verse of the Quran starts off, every chapter anyway of the Quran starts off, in the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate. Mercy and compassion are the two characteristics of God. So that shouldn't lead to violence, except in very extreme conditions. But you can understand how some people could say, we have been attacked, we want to take some sort of revenge and assert our liberty. So I'm not defending that, but Christians have been in the same position, and of course lots of Christians thought, should I fight in the Second World War? And most thought that one should. So my case is this: I don't think religion causes violence. But religion is a very powerful motivating factor for whatever it is that you believe in strongly. So if you believe strongly in the words of Jesus, turn the other cheek and love your enemy, then that's a faith which is not going to give rise to violence. If it does give rise to violence, then they are contradicting the words of their own Saviour, Jesus Christ. So here we have to say, well, Christianity does stand out among the world religions as quite clearly, in the words of Jesus, against violence, and certainly against aggression. So there's no doubt about it all. And I have talked to the Ministry of Defence about the Sermon on the Mount, and when I talk about turn the other cheek, they all say, well, how the hell are we going to do that? So you have to say, that's a very difficult question. There has been one Quaker Minister of Defence in the history of Britain. He lasted 3 months. And you can see the quandary that people get into. But it's quite clear to me, it's false to say religion is the cause of violence. Ask the Ministry of Defence, ask MI5, what are the chief causes of terrorism in the world today? They produce official reports. I've got one here. I noted in this book, Is Religion Dangerous?, which I wrote. And what they say is, well, the causes, the main cause of terrorism are a sense of grievance, a sense of economic deprivation, a sense of exclusion, and most of all, a sense of revolt against the dictatorship of their own rulers. The West comes in as an afterthought, really, because the West is seen as supporting the dictator rulers that they are opposed to. So there you are, a complicated question, but I think it's perfectly clear. Religion doesn't figure highly as a cause of violence, but religion is always a motivating force. And the Christian religion is clear about two things. First of all, we all sin, so violence is probably going to arise, even though it's lamentable. And secondly, that Jesus clearly taught you should love your enemies. However you work that out, it's not an incitement to violence. Right, so let's go on now to the second one, and I'm going to ask here, is it true that religion teaches people just to believe on no evidence, just believe what I say, don't ask questions? Well, I've taught in a lot of schools, with a lot of sermons and course. I don't think I've ever told anybody to believe something just because I say so. I mean, that would be ludicrous. Having been a philosopher for 60 years now, I know that what I say is usually not right. So, at least my colleagues tell me it's not right. So, you have to be rather diffident about saying, believe what I say just because I say so. But there is a place for authority in religion, and that place belongs to revelation. So that's certainly true. There is such a thing as revelation. But is that believed without any evidence? Well, I don't think that would be true. And what I want to say here is very important, culturally speaking, that there is, in our culture, a widespread belief among people who write in newspapers and speak on television that science has somehow replaced religion. I know that Alistair talked a bit about this last week, but I mean, it's true that I get the New Scientist every week, which is a very popular scientific magazine, and it clearly thinks that religion is a little bit weird and not quite respectable. I remember an editorial in the New Scientist which said, gave some physical theory about the universe, that we, human beings, are three-dimensional holograms of two-dimensional beings on the edge of the known universe. It's been theory by somebody in California, of course, but a respectable physicist, actually. And the comment by the editor of the New Scientist was, well, this sounds weird, but at least it's not religion. And it is true now that some physicists say things that are more weird, not you, Paul, but they say things that are more weird than anything that any religious person has ever thought about. That doesn't mean they're irrational. I mean, things can be weird, that is, they can be non-commonsensical. I assure you that quantum physics, modern physics, is not commonsensical. And never mind quantum physics, I'm a philosopher, so philosophy is not commonsensical. The first thing you have to do in philosophy is to show people that common sense is wrong about almost everything. That, for example, when you think you are sitting in this room, seeing solid colored objects in 3 dimensions, you are totally misled. That's common sense. But what you're actually doing, according to one of my colleagues at least, is seeing probability waves in 11-dimensional hyperspace. So there you are. And we all know what Edison used to say: you think you're solid, but actually you're mostly empty space, with a few protons and electrons, but mostly empty space. So the world as it really is very different from the world as it appears to us. Now that's what religion basically thinks. And what religious people have always said is, well, perhaps not in the pub, but when they've gone and written books about it, they've said, actually, the fundamental nature of the reality in which we all live is mind. It is consciousness and purpose and will. And that cosmic mind we call God. So that it's not that God made a universe because he felt like it, it's that the inner nature of the universe itself is spirit. It is not matter. So here's a huge intellectual debate. Now, all I'll say about that is if you do philosophy, you will find that in the history of philosophy, almost every known classical philosopher believes that reality is spirit and not fundamentally material. That matter is the appearance of spirit, just as we, as solid three-dimensional objects, are what appears of a reality which is very, very different, even from a physicist's point of view. But maybe there's something beyond that too, and that the reality is God. It's in God that we live and move and have our being. Well, that view, that it's in a spiritual reality that this physical world is an appearance of, that view was held by Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Leibniz, Descartes, Hegel, almost every great philosopher you can think of. Now, they might all have been wrong, but they were not all stupid. They were not all people who believed something without any evidence, just on blind faith. In fact, it's the materialists who believe things on blind faith. I mean, a materialist is a person who thinks there is nothing in existence but lumps of matter, and that all that you are nothing more than electrons, neurons in your brain, mashing about together and producing things that seem to be emotions and thoughts. You are nothing but electrons. That nothing but makes a philosopher say, how do you know that you're nothing but electrons? Does physics tell you that? Does chemistry tell you that? I mean, it can talk about electrons, good, but does it say, and there's nothing else? What about feelings, and what about thoughts? What about truth and beauty? What about our whole moral lives, the things that we think are important? Well, the sciences don't really talk about those. The humanities are in a different set of departments in universities. Now, that's not a good thing. I think it should get together a lot more, actually. But nevertheless, a science is a specific limited area of research, and it's getting more and more limited because there's more and more to know about little bits of the physical world, and it deals with how physical things relate to one another in ways that you can experiment on and duplicate and get other people to agree about. But the life of the mind, life of feeling, the life of moral demand, of repentance, of sin and salvation, that life is the important one in a human world. And that's not susceptible to scientific explanation because you can't have laws like the law of gravity which apply to what you think. There are no laws of thought that you can actually write down and experiment on and show to be true because people keep having new thoughts that have never been had before. At least I keep trying to do that. Einstein managed it, some people managed it. If you have a new thought, that is something that doesn't occur in the physical world itself. So the big debate here is not between faith and scientific knowledge. That's not the debate. The debate is whether the world is fundamentally mind-like. And a materialist would say the hard problem for a materialist is consciousness. How is it that electrons produce our awareness of things happening? How does the universe come to recognize its own nature and understand itself, and even apparently begin to change nature to a certain degree? How on earth would that happen? That's a huge problem for a materialist, and I don't believe any materialist philosopher, and there are some, very good philosophers who are materialists, but it's a small minority, and historically it's a tiny minority. That problem hasn't been resolved. So the idealists, that is, the people who believe in God, as well as some other people, but idealists believe that the fundamental nature of reality is consciousness, that that's what is most apparent and immediate to us, that we are aware, that we are under moral compulsion, and that we need to work out in our lives what goals we are going to aim at. And these things are quite different from physical reality. I'm not splitting the world up into physical and spiritual. I'm saying the two are intertwined. And Christianity, again, believes, believing in the incarnation, that the spiritual, God, becomes one, identified with the material. And I myself think that's the chief message of Christianity, that the material world will become participant in the spiritual world, in the life of God. The first letter of Peter says that we are all destined to share in the nature of God. And all Christians believe that, because all Christians believe that we are members of the body of Christ, and that Christ is divine, so we are all members of a divine reality. And that bringing together that union of the material and the spiritual is the special message of Christianity. So I think materialism, when materialists talk about faith being not based on evidence, they're missing out all the evidence of human consciousness and human life and human purpose and human striving. And those things are even more real than things that physicists talk about, which, oh no, are rather abstract, and we're not quite sure what the reality is that underlies them. So I'm just saying, this is a big intellectual debate. What would be false would be to say faith is just blind, no evidence, whereas science, well, that has all the evidence and tells you the whole truth. And the two things wrong with that are, why should any science tell you the whole truth about everything? Who would tell you that? No science would tell you that. So there's at least one thing that science doesn't tell you, whether science tells you everything. Right? No science tells you that. But on the other hand, the other thing that's wrong is, well, the most important things in life are the things of consciousness. And how do you deal with that? You deal with it in poetry, in literature, in art. You deal with it in the humanities. And you're into a totally different world. So my response to the view, to the question, isn't faith bad, isn't it bad for the world because it breeds ignorance, is no. As a matter of fact, the whole of Western culture is a product of Christian striving after knowledge. And Christians believe that the Gospel of John says, well, they don't believe it, the Gospel of John does say that in the beginning was the Word. And you remember that the word in Greek is logos, and that word means reason or intellect, or a word that is connected with rationality. So the world was created, Christianity says, through the reason, through the rationality of God. So it's going to be a rational world. More than that, human beings were created in the image of God, and so their minds have the capacity to understand the rationality of the world. So again, one of the unique features of Christianity is that Christianity says this is not an absurd universe where things just happen, you just have to believe them, and the odder they are, the more you should believe them. Christianity doesn't say that. It says the whole world is rationally structured. It's based on reason, and we can trust our reason because it's a reflection of the divine reason which is really there. So in reality, there really is reason, and therefore there is purpose. Because where you have reason, you have purpose. If you have a reason for something, that becomes your purpose, the goal at which you aim. So again, religion comes out of this, or Christianity in particular, comes out of this rather well, as not something which undermines rationality at all. So thirdly, is it immoral then? Is Christianity immoral? Again, you get in the writings of some modern commentators the fact that Christianity has immoral statements. Now, of course, they always look at the beginning of the Old Testament for this. So you can find things which say, go and slaughter all the Amalekites, right? Well, you know, off you go, you found one. Is that a command? I mean, a Jew wouldn't take that seriously. A Jew would say, look, that is in the Hebrew scriptures, but I mean, things have moved on since then, and we have prophets who said things that really qualify that quite markedly. And for a Christian, of course, Jesus quite clearly says, again, I appeal to the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard, it's called the great antitheses there in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 to 7. You have heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You've heard that. And that's there. That's there in the Jewish law, Torah, it's in the Old Testament. But I say to you, do not resist evil. So Jesus actually, well, is change the right word? He says, according to Matthew's Gospel, what Jesus says is, well, I came to fulfill the law, but also to overcome it. So that fulfilling, there isn't an English word for that. Well, there is, but nobody likes it. So I've tried and nobody does like it. The word is sublet, if you're interested, but nobody likes it. But the word means that you fulfill something by overcoming it, by changing its nature. But that change fulfills it. And the best example of this is the life of Jesus itself. That Jesus' life fulfills the prophecies of the Old Testament. Well, it does. Christians have always believed that. This is the Messiah predicted. But he fulfills it by changing it. He's not a Messiah who throws the Romans out of Jerusalem. He's not a Messiah who becomes a political liberator. He's a spiritual liberator and one who saves from sin, not from the Romans. So that's a complete change. And yet you can see that it's a fulfillment. So I'll try this word. It's a sublation of the law. So what Christianity does to the law is it both fulfills it and overcomes it at the same time. And that's the sublimity of Christianity, that it can do that. And that has to be true of everything we say about the Bible. Paul did this, of course, to Jesus. Jesus had done it to the Old Testament. You think, well, that must be the last word, but it wasn't. Paul got in a last word. Because Jesus, according to Matthew's Gospel, now this may raise some disagreements, good, we just have to live with them. According to Matthew's Gospel, Jesus said, anyone who teaches that the least important commandment of the law, there are 316 of these commandments, by the way, anybody who says that the least important one should be broken is least in the kingdom of heaven. Well, I challenge everyone tonight to tell me if they know what the 316 commandments of the law are. If you don't know, how do you know whether you've broken them or not? Do you even care? No, you don't. You don't care. Why don't you care when Jesus said even the least one is important? You don't care because of St. Paul, and also because of Peter, who had a vision, but he didn't get it from Jesus. Peter, before his vision, that sheet coming down from heaven with clean and unclean food on it, before that vision, he wouldn't even eat with Gentiles. As a good Jew, he thought it was unclean to eat with Gentiles. And he walked with Jesus throughout Jesus' ministry. He hadn't learned from Jesus that you actually can eat with Gentiles, right? He got it from a vision from God. And Paul, I don't know where Paul got it from, but he actually got it from a vision of the risen Christ, but not from a living Jesus whom he'd never known. So the point is, in the first generation of Christianity, the teaching of Jesus was transformed from being, in Matthew chapter 5, a teaching that the Jewish law, the Torah, all 316 commandments must be kept to the finest detail. It actually says every jot and tittle, it says in the authorized version. That must be kept. And we got to a position in the first generation of Christians where they said, no, we needn't bother with that. We don't have to do that at all. And some Christians said there were only 10 commandments for some reason. Well, I'm telling you, there are 316. 10 is nothing. I mean, not worth thinking about. And the 10 commandments don't even include the most important one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. That's the most important. When Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment? He said, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul went on to say, and this is the law. The whole law is summed up in that. So Jesus taught Torah. He was an Orthodox Jew. He taught that the people he was speaking to, who were all Jewish, of course, should keep the law. He never said that you needn't bother. And we know that that's true because In Acts chapter 15, if you want to check this out, there's a record of the first meeting of the church, the first council of the church, which debated whether or not you should keep the law, whether Christians should keep the law. And they debated it. They didn't say, Jesus said, therefore, this is what we'll do. They asked, well, what is for and what is against? And I don't know if you remember what the decision of that council actually was. It was quite an interesting decision. It was a compromise decision. It was, Gentiles who become Christian needn't get circumcised. There are reasons for that. You don't have any anesthetics. You're a mature adult, and they use a flint knife. So probably you would prefer not to get circumcised, right? So you needn't be circumcised, but we did that text, we don't believe in, but you still must eat kosher food. You must not eat meat with the blood in it. So a compromise decision. And within another 100 years, that had been lost as well. We don't care if we eat meat with blood in it. As Christians, I mean, we don't ask, is this food kosher? It's not a question we would ask. So things have changed in this respect, and Christian morality develops. It changes, and you see how it changes throughout each generation. So what is wrong with people who say Christian morality is obsolete is, well, the bits they're reading are of course obsolete, the bits of very Bronze Age writings in the Old Testament. Of course they're obsolete. Jesus made them obsolete. So as Christians will say they're definitely obsolete. So if you read lots of laws, there are lots of laws in the Old Testament about the conquest of Canaan. And you say, well, those are all obsolete. Jesus said, love your enemy, turn the other cheek. He didn't say, go and conquer someone. And in a similar way, Jesus transfigured every item of the law, and by saying love is the one important command. Love of God, love of your neighbour, as yourself. That didn't make things easier, it made things harder actually, to love your next door neighbour. Well, I don't know who your next door is, so I won't inquire too much, but just imagine the worst person you can imagine down somebody else's street. Suppose they were your neighbour and they lived next door. How would you love them? Oh, I don't know. You need to think about that. But at least it's a Christian command, it's from Jesus, and it certainly doesn't say throw them out or attack them or put your rubbish in their garden or anything like that. So it's a very hard command. And the important thing is we have to work out exactly what it means. Now, the Jews can do this, you see. The Jews who have Torah, it's a living tradition. The Jewish law goes on. You have rabbis whose job it is to interpret the law for different periods of time. And so, of course, how you apply the law will depend on your situation. Christians sometimes haven't learned to do this. Christians sometimes think, oh, we ought to just keep the law as it's written. Well, that is exactly what's wrong with the Islamic State. They look at ancient laws in the Quran and say, oh, you must keep these because it's written down. Cut off a thief's hands. But the vast majority of Muslims, all traditional Muslims, say, no, that's an ancient law which we do much better to be right, because it's always better to be merciful and compassionate, and cutting off people's hands is not very merciful when it comes down to it. So Islam changes, Judaism changes, and of course Christianity changes too. Monogamy, what about that? One man, one woman. That's not in the New Testament. You won't find that. Only bishops have to have one wife. Solomon had 1,000 wives and nobody thought that was a bad thing. He was turned off for having too many horses. So you say, well, all the sexual things in the Old Testament have been overcome, really. I mean, if you talk about concubines, no, we don't have those anymore. Slaves, no, we don't have those anymore. So it's just obvious that things have changed. I'm not going into any specific moral issue at this point. I'm just saying it's clear to anybody who takes a historical view that the one guiding principle for Christian morality has always been the love of all human beings as if they were your neighbours, or even as if they were your children. And that love must help you to find out what policies you should have to make that a reality if you can, or come as near as you can to it. And that's been the guiding principle. And St. Paul actually put this as clearly as anybody ever could when he said, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And in case you haven't got the point, he said, Christ is the end of the law. That word end has a double meaning. Christ is the fulfillment of the law, but also the abolition of the law in its literal form. And we all agree with that. Everybody in this room agrees with that, because nobody in this room thinks that we should obey the thick 316 commandments of Torah. Isn't that right? Yes, it is. So we've made the leap. We made the leap years ago. Of course, that doesn't mean there should be no laws. What it means is the laws should be framed after due reflection on the principle of self-giving, agapic love, which is the key principle. So is Christian morality immoral or just believing on authority? No, not at all. There is a place for authority. That gets rather complicated because, of course, our children are right to obey what we say, and there are perhaps traditions, there's ages of reflection, and we do well to listen to what people have thought. But if, for example, John Calvin said something, we might respect that, and we might think it's saying a great insight, but John Calvin wasn't God. And there are going to be things that John Calvin was wrong about. I mean, there are going to be things that Calvin... The same goes, I can't think of any Anglican who I'd put in the position of John Calvin, actually. But whoever it is, I mean, say the Archbishop of Canterbury says something, I'm entitled as a priest to say, well, I think he's wrong about that. Now, I shouldn't just say that, say, well, I don't like that. I've got to have reasons, I've got to reflect, I've got to take it seriously. But it's not something that I really have to obey unthinkingly, that's the point. Obedience without reflection is not to be commended, except in very young people. And this is true, in case you don't think it is, it's true of the Roman Catholic Church too, because in fact there has never in the Roman Catholic Church been any statement on ethical matters which is strictly infallible. There has never been an infallible statement on ethics in the Roman Catholic tradition. That means that conscience trumps authority, even for a Roman Catholic. Of course, you will get thrown out of the church, but I mean, that's not. You start another one. An example, a good example, is the handbook of health and belief, that handbook has a survey of all the social surveys that have been done on this sort of subject. So I'll just summarize what they say. Again, if you want the exact text that are in this book, Is Religion Dangerous? And I cite the exact text there. But this is what they say. It appears to be true. Now, when you take a social survey, of course, you've got to define what a believer is, right? That's a bit difficult. You've got to define what happiness is. But so what they do on the whole is say a believer is somebody who goes to church once a month. At least once a month. And happiness is, if somebody says I'm happy, then they probably are. And the records are that people who go to church at least once a month record that they feel happier very much more often than people who don't go to church. There you are. So they ask people on the street, you know, how social surveys go. How seriously you should take this, I'm not quite sure. But it does show that actually people don't get terribly depressed by going to church on the whole. So that's something. So it's not depressing people. And of course the record on drug abuse, on criminality, is much higher among people who don't go to church once a month than among people who do. And I think my slightly meant to be humorous remark about the Mothers' Union makes the point that actually most institutions run by the churches are charitable. And again, it's a well-known social statistic that the largest proportion of charitable giving comes from people who have religious beliefs. Now that's not surprising, because part of religious belief is that you ought to give money to those who are in need, of course. But it is a statistic anyway, so it's an enormous amount of good is actually done by religious groups. What about mental illness? Well, there's a psychologist, there was a psychologist in Oxford, Michael Argyle. He spent his whole life trying to show that having a Christian belief was correlated with a certain sort of personality, maybe epileptic or schizophrenic or something. Well, is that true? Can you correlate? If you have this personality, oh yes, you would be a Christian, you're that sort of person. Can you do that? And the conclusion of his life's work was a rather disappointing result, that there's no discernible correlation at all between mental illness and religious belief. And it's often said that a great number of schizophrenics have religious beliefs, and that's actually false statistically. The number which I quote from the most recent survey here is that among schizophrenic patients in hospital who hear voices telling them to do things, only 1 in 7 associates this with religion. In fact, these days, quite a number of schizophrenics associate the voices they hear with aliens from space. So you've got to associate them with somebody, but you associate them with religion only if that's the only thing that you have in your environment. Nowadays, flying saucers are more popular, apparently. But 1 in 7, I mean, that's not a majority. That's a very small number. It means 6 out of every 7 people who are schizophrenic have no religious beliefs at all. So again, it's not true that you can make a correlation between mental illness and belief. So what do we make of that? Well, I suppose you can also say, this will be a happy making thought for the night if nothing else is, people with religious beliefs tend to live longer and be healthier. So these are correlations. Obviously you can find exceptions to correlations. I mean, they're just generalizable views. But at least it says, well, religion is not doing people demonstrable harm. It does some people demonstrable harm, that's true, but a very small number, and it does huge amounts of good to other people. I mean, that's obvious when you think about it. If you were a Christian and you really thought that your wrongdoings had been forgiven and that you were able to live with God forever and that God loved you to the extent that Jesus showed that God's love was utterly self-sacrificing, if you believe that, you're not going to get more miserable about it. And people sometimes say, well, doesn't the thought of being a terrible sinner make you miserable? Well, yes, if you think you couldn't be forgiven. But if you think that, you haven't quite got the Christian gospel. I once bought a book from Blackwell's called, you know, the Good News Bible? I quite like that. Anyway, I bought one called the Bad News Bible. And the Bad News Bible quoted every horrible statement that was ever made. You know, if you haven't got oil in your lamp, you'll never get into the feast. Right? It quoted all these statements, which if you took those on their own, you probably would get depressed and think, oh dear, I'm shut out, I'm never going to get to heaven. But that's not a gospel. And Jesus' gospel, it was good news. And actually there's one interesting one, and I'll leave you with this thought, because it's not one that people read very much. You know the story of Noah, where everybody got drowned except 8 people in the ark. Okay, so they were all drowned. Why? Because every impulse of their heart was corrupt. I mean, they were really wicked. Okay? Everything they thought and did was really evil. So they got drowned. Now, if you go and read the letters of Peter in the New Testament, what it said, go back and read these, they're very interesting. And not many sermons get preached about them, about the letters of Peter. In the letter of Peter it says, after Jesus died, he descended to the place of the dead, Hades. Well, we all say that in the creed anyway. And there he preached to the dead. Now, what was the content of Jesus' sermon? Faced with all these people who've been drowned in the days of Noah, did he say, well, I've come to tell you, you're all doomed. There's no way out. Have a nice day. Was that a sermon? Well, perhaps some people might preach sermons like that. No, he preached the news of universal salvation. And what it says in the text is, although these are the people who had every thought of their minds had been corrupt. And it says, although they died in the flesh like men, they lived in the spirit like gods. Check that out. It's so rarely used as a subject for sermon, and it's so important that however bad and corrupt you are, Christ is there, even in hell, in Hades, in the place of the dead, offering forgiveness and union with God. That's a gospel. Well, if you want a gospel, that's really it. That's not bad news for anybody. And I think that's the heart of the Christian gospel too, and it's there in the New Testament. So it's not the case that anyone is doomed to irrevocable damnation. It is the case that everyone is offered the love of God, which is absolutely unlimited. And if you're a Christian who believes that, then you don't have to believe that everyone will be saved. I quote Pope John Paul on this subject. I happen to agree with Pope John Paul on this subject. Pope John Paul says we cannot guarantee that everyone, including Hitler and Stalin and everyone, will be saved, but we should certainly pray for that, and it is possible. So that says nobody is beyond the love of God. Whether people respond to that or not is perhaps up to them. So we cannot say that everyone will be saved whether they want to be or not. But we can say God's offer of salvation is absolutely unrestricted. I think perhaps my final quotation from the letter of James would be that God desires everyone to be saved. What God desires doesn't necessarily come to pass. But what God desires, God must make possible for everyone. That gospel is not a gospel of terror and one which will give rise to mental illness. So I think, I've given a very dispassionate, equal, biased account of Christianity. Well, that's what I think. But I think if you look at the facts, it is clear that actually Christian faith, the faith in the gospel of God's redeeming love in the person of Jesus, dealing with human evil, which is present everywhere, by forgiveness and ultimately sanctification, that gospel is not something that is either unevidenced, irrational, mentally debilitating, or one that gives rise to violence. So religion in this form, I'm not talking about every form of religion, but this form of Christianity is certainly a good thing for the world. Let's have some more of it. Thank you.